Ngā hoe whā, e hui hui mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to the special episode of the Auckland Writers' Festival Winter Series. My name is Tina Makareti and I programmed the RENÉE series for the cancelled 2020 festival. The series focused on what is vibrant and exciting in Māori and Indigenous creative writing in Aotearoa today, so this special episode is a little taste of some of that program. A big thanks to our very generous venue and technical partner, Auckland Live, and Copyright Licensing New Zealand for their support in making this series possible. I'm talking to three of our original RENÉE guests today, focusing on their most recent work, which they will also read from briefly. We'd love to have your questions throughout using the chat functions on Facebook and YouTube, and please feel free to share this episode via social media. The writer's works are available for sale by clicking the Buy the Book link in the description. A reminder that with a live stream event, there is a risk of spammers, so please do not click on any links in the comments unless they are supplied by the Auckland Writers' Festival. And the sessions are free to view, so ignore any requests for credit card details. So I'd like to welcome our three writers in the order in which they'll appear. First, we're going to be discussing RENÉE's novel, The Wild Card. Nau mai, haere mai, RENÉE. How's it in Otaki this morning?
It's a bit grey. It's a wee bit grey, but it's okay. I'm nice and warm.
Good. And secondly, we'll be meeting Joshua Whitehead to discuss his novel, Jonny Appleseed, all the way from Calgary. Tanze, Joshua. And you're in lockdown still, I guess.
Yeah, Tanzania to Mark. Hi, my friends. I still am in the Western Canada prairies where it was raining earlier and now it's pure sun. So you take it as you roll.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you for joining us. And finally, we'll be treated to some music and poetry from RUBY MAE HINEPUNUI SOLLY's album, Pōneke. Kia ora, RUBY. Kei te pihi a koe.
Oh, kei te mawīwi au. Engari, I'm looking forward to today very much, nevertheless.
Kia ora. So thanks so much, all of you, for coming to talk to us. I'll talk to RENÉE now, and we'll look forward to speaking to you, Joshua and RUBY, after that. So playwright, novelist, poet, memoirist, and blogger RENÉE, who is Ngāti Kahungunu, has documented New Zealand's social history in work that includes Wednesday to Come, Setting the Table, and the memoir, These Two Hands. Her most recent book, The Wild Card, is her first crime novel, and it has just been longlisted for a Ngaio Marsh Award for Best Crime Novel. Congratulations, RENÉE. Among her many awards, RENÉE is a recipient of an Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to literature and drama, a Creative New Zealand Te Waka Toi Award, and a Sir Kingi Ihaka Award. In 2018, RENÉE received the prestigious New Zealand Prime Minister's Award for Literary Achievement in Fiction. Still writing prolifically in her 90s, RENÉE is an inspiration to us all. Kia ora, whaia.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. The Wild Card is about a character called Ruby Palmer, who was left in a kete at the back door of the Pōrohiwi home for children when she was a baby, and then at 7 years old discovered that Betty, the person who stopped bad stuff happening to Ruby at the home, has drowned. A New Zealand Books review says the treatment of children put into state care and abused in the institutions that were meant to care for them is a deep part of the story. So too, though, is the fight for justice, as is the institutional racism that still pervades society today. So this is a crime genre novel, which is a new form for you, RENÉE, but there is also a personal story at the heart of The Wild Card. And I was wondering if, in that case, was writing a crime novel quite different from your other writing, or more like your memoir than we might guess?
Well, it came about by accident because I was teaching a group, the first crime novel workshop I'd ever done, and I'd made up the 10 sessions over the January, and we met in February, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to know if the course really works or not. So I decided at that moment that I would do the course along with the students So I wrote 10 pages a week, which is the deal. They don't come on the course if they don't do that. And so at the end of the course, I had 100 pages. And I thought, well, you know, I'm a child of the 30s, waste not, want not, so I'll use it. And I've read thousands and thousands and thousands of crime novels, and I'm interested in the history of crime novels and how people, as readers, some of us anyway, like to be scared or mystified or whatever. And so I wrote it, and I have also been a follower of the inquiry into sexual abuse in state care, and am disappointed with the progress of that. And I thought of the Lake Alice inquiry as well, which is still dragging on years and years later. And so I thought it was time to kind of write a story about that and show lives that had been perhaps Ruby escapes the worst of that, but she doesn't escape the memories and, of course, Betty's death. And I wanted to clothe all that in a style that people would read. So I chose a kind of style that is a light sort of funny, bit cynical, lots of swearing, that sort of thing. And yeah, and so that's how I did it. I'm not a really brave person in reading. I mean, I don't like old women being killed for obvious reasons, all that sort of thing. But I knew that you were supposed to have the splinter of ice in your heart if you wrote a crime novel. So I thought, well, I better have the crime is an historical one that the book centers around, but I thought maybe I should have one in the present day. So I killed off one of the characters, and I didn't really like it. I didn't like doing it. I liked the character. So I just, on the Monday, I worried about it all weekend, and on the Monday I just rolled back the stone and and there he was alive again. And so that's why I call the book Cozy Noir, because it's really has a dark streak, but it's quite a cozy sort of read.
I love that, cozy noir, because I'm a wimp when it comes to crime as well. Yeah. So yeah, fantastic to encounter that and kind of be accessing crime through the way that you're doing it. And so is writing at this stage in your life different with so much experience? Is it still thrilling?
Oh yes, and it's still hard. And you still make mistakes and you go over things. You write some pages 150 times. It's exactly the same. And I don't know what happened to getting old and sitting in the sun and reading a book. I haven't reached it yet. I seem to be quite busy. And yeah, it's being nearly 91 doesn't really, I mean, I sort of never expected to live a long time anyway, so it's a sort of a surprise, and I'm just lucky that my brain has lasted and sort of gets better in a way.
Brilliant. Well, we can all hope for that, for the story to keep being interesting and our brains getting better. I'm interested in something you said in. It's actually all the way back in 1995, but it was a really interesting quote to me because I think I still hear young Māori saying it today. And you said, and sorry to quote you back to yourself, but I'll always be an outsider in both worlds. Sometimes I feel alienated from the European world and sometimes from the Māori world because I sometimes feel inadequate in both of them. And I had two thoughts about this. One, that maybe this is how writers are made. This feeling of alienation and inadequacy is such a kind of a place that a lot of us come from. But also I often think a lot about how we help people see such things, not as inadequacy, but as a gift. And I was wondering if your perspective had changed at all, whether you see that as a strength of your own writing at this point.
I think, yeah, I don't think it's changed. I think I always see myself standing on bridge, one foot on one side, one foot on the other, And I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable that it's not heartbreaking. At one stage of my life, I was very conscious of my feelings. But you see, the thing is, I don't feel at home all that well in the Pākehā world either. I don't feel at home in the literary world, for that matter. And I don't know how. I was talking to a young woman about this. She wanted me to talk about dramaturging, and I was talking about understanding the language of it, which I didn't. And I think part of my feeling not at home with a lot of areas is simply that I just don't speak that language. I think it's because I went out to work so young and I didn't go to high school. So I missed that very important area where there's a lot of growth and friendships and, you know, little links here and there. And I just didn't have that. And I just went straight to work. And so my contemporaries at work were older women who were lovely to me. They just were great. And but I missed out on this other area that everyone else, like you and Ruby and Josh, had probably had. And so there's a kind of ease that you probably have that I've had to learn, and perhaps not very well, because sometimes I think, oh, bugger it, I just can't be bothered. So, like, it's a bit late now anyway, isn't it?
Oh, kia ora whaia. I think that's actually something that a lot of people could identify with, actually, even now, for sure. Would you like to read to us from the wild card?
Okay. This is kia ora koutou. This is from the first chapter, a short piece from the first chapter of the wild card. She moved swiftly but carefully. The driveway was rough, breaks in the tar seal, lots of little bits of shingle, traps for an unwary foot. The ragged, untidy mess of manuka, koromiko, harakeke, and 1,000 weeds made awkward ghostly shapes in the dim light. She could smell mint. Must be wild mint in the paddock over the stream. Mint loved water. Even the promise of it was enough to make it send out its perfume. Only a foolish gardener would plant mint in the garden. Mint is a great colonizer, brought here by other great colonizers. The last time she'd been on this driveway, she was 7, and so terrified she'd wet her pants as she ran. Now, 30 years later, she was more concerned about getting in and out without being seen. Where would be the easiest place to break in? Window or door? The door would be better. The long sash windows were notoriously easy to jiggle, but you ran the risk of breaking the glass. Although if the building was going to be pulled down anyway, would that really matter? She guessed the law wouldn't see it that way. Anyway, she'd be in and out reasonably quickly, whichever way she chose. She stopped by the path over the large culvert, ignored the stream, glaring palely through the gloom, stared at the back of the house. Well, this wasn't too bad. No ghosts of matron or the balaclava man, no drowned Betty lying on the path. Why had she built up such a fear of the place? It was nothing but a sad old house that had outlived its time. It wasn't responsible for what human beings had done in its walls. She took hold of the window frame and shook it. The house grumbled in protest. The window was secured by little levers each side, not really burglar-proof. If she slid her knife up the side, where age had walked the wood, it wouldn't be too difficult. She leaned on the door, and the house moaned like a ghost was walking the old passageway. Shivers of possibility trembled in the air. She turned and stared at the shed. The door hung open, so she pushed it in, a mess of cans and bottles, some Kentucky Fried packets, Big Mac burger bags, even a used condom. Yucko, must have been really drunk or really desperate. She started down the other side. Her arm caught the end of a wet branch and water splashed on her jeans, cold needle tips on warm skin. The lower she went, the more she became aware of the change in light. It hadn't exactly been well lit further up, but down here it was really dark. The clinging moisture embraced her in its damp grey arms, made her want to be home, warm and alone, sipping a glass of red, listening to one of those old songs that Kate had loved. Sam Cooke, she thought, a change is going to come. Change had already come, and she hated it. One of the bushes moved. She stopped, breathed quickly, heart beating like a snare drum tattoo. An illusion caused by the wind? Hardly. This was a breeze by Porohiwi standards. First rule, don't muck around. She swerved away, and now it was definite. The shadow moved too. She was 3/4 of the way down, too late to go back. What to do? Take over? Take off? Take them on? The old mantra. Not much choice here. She turned, took up the stance. The shadow moved faster now, not worried about noise as it crashed through the bushes. He came out of the dark, a running black ghost. Kia ora.
Yeah, kia ora, RENÉE. And we have just one audience question that we might be able to finish with. And that is about being, does being lesbian add to that feeling of being marginalised that you were talking about?
No, actually it doesn't. But
Brilliant.
like I don't care. So it I was lucky. Like I was 50 when I came out, so that's a really good age to so you can say whatever you like really. And of course I did say whatever I liked, and yeah, I think I had the confidence and thinking, oh well, nothing else bad can happen. I've found myself and this is what it is. And so I just started writing, and yeah, no, I think it's added a richness to my life that I'll always be very grateful for.
Oh, kia ora. Ngā mihi, RENÉE, that's really lovely to hear, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. We'd love to talk to you at the end and after I speak to Joshua and Ruby, so if you could stay with us. And of course, for those audience members to remember, you can send through your questions on YouTube and, on Facebook. So our next guest is Joshua Whitehead. Joshua Whitehead is a Two-Spirit Oji Nehio member of the Peguis First Nation. He is currently a PhD candidate, lecturer and Killam scholar at the University of Calgary, where he studies Indigenous literatures and cultures with a focus on gender and sexuality. He is the author of the futuristic cyberpunk poetry collection, Full-Metal Indigiqueer. He is also the author of Jonny Appleseed, our focus for today, which was longlisted and shortlisted for several literary awards and won the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Fiction and the Georges Bounet Award for Fiction. And Jonny Appleseed, the protagonist, is a Two-Spirit Indigiqueer who leaves Winnipeg, Manitoba to attend his stepfather's funeral on a reserve. In a review, Alicia Elliott described it thus: every so often, a book comes along that feels like a milestone, with revolution nestled beneath every sentence, every word. She also says, perhaps the most refreshing part of this book is the frankness with which Whitehead writes about sex, particularly queer sex. So just a warning about content in case you're watching with children. Tanzia, Joshua.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. When I was in Toronto a couple of years ago, unfortunately, I did not cross your path because we were there at different times, but there was a real buzz around you and Jonny Appleseed. But however, I suspect many New Zealanders haven't encountered your work before. Jonny Appleseed is both raw and lyrical, and it's confronting and beautiful. Through the language and rhythms of your writing, I felt immersed in the particular sounds of your homelands. your people and a particular way of being in the world. So I wonder, as an introduction to the book, whether you might talk about some of the different influences on your work and your voice as a writer.
Yeah, Jonny Appleseed is a character I've had for kind of in me or with me for the latter part of like over a decade. So he started as this kind of Bildungsroman that I wanted to write when I was in my late teens, early 20s, when I was very obsessed with the beatniks at the time, On the Road and Ginsberg kind of being the big ones. But I was really interested in kind of discovering what it'd be like for an Indigenous youth and a queer Indigenous youth to be kind of living this beatnik lifestyle. So he's been with me for a while. He was more of a tertiary character. And then I wrote Full-Metal Indigiqueer, and we had these kind of sensual beach poems, which didn't quite fit with the larger, maybe cyborg elements of the novel or the book itself. So we cut these beach scenes, but I loved them so much. They were really evocative. They were from several beaches in Manitoba. And then lo and behold, Jonny Appleseed, AKA the Glitter Princess, I call him, just kind of sashayed into my mind and was like, this is my time, write me in. So I did, and he started as a short story and then became a novella. And then as he is a little bit of a diva, it was like, write me into a full novel. So that's how Jonny kind of came into being. But he's very much influenced, I would say, by folks such as like James Baldwin. And then there was a Canadian writer, Raziel Reed, who won a Governor General for a book called When Everything Feels Like the Movies, which was also published by my same publisher, Arsenal Pulp. And it was kind of the first time I thought, okay, it's really interesting to maybe push the boundaries of what we consider innocence, I guess I would say, in writing about and for and with youth. So Jonny Appleseed came into being, one, because of my fascination with him as a character, two, because of what was kind of happening perhaps in what we call the Canadian literary scene, and three, maybe from a blind spot, I would say, in thinking about healthy and respectful and powerful representations of gender and sex and sexuality written by and for Indigenous, Two-Spirit, queer, trans folks. So often it's written from a vantage point of an outsider, primarily a non-Indigenous, primarily white, cis author who kind of writes about these in ways that are just misconstrued, tangled, not well researched. So I kind of just said, I have this character, he's full of glitter, he likes to talk, he's very sexy, and I think it's time to kind of bring him to the stage. So it was kind of a mismatch of history, my own personal history, my research interests in my PhD, and then what was kind of shaping up in the Canadian literature scene.
Brilliant. Yeah. You actually already answered one of my questions, which was about that kind of exchange between Jonny and you, which seems to be quite visceral as you're reading, and the Glitter Princess. So, but there's also something of, I guess, the Indigenous places that you live and place is really strong there. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that? Or the kind of way, you know, how people, I guess because I'm reading as a New Zealander, how people talk in Canada, which is familiar to me, but was very comforting even as an outsider.
Definitely. So I would say like Jonny Appleseed is primarily a rumination on maybe 2 or 3 topics, but the biggest one I think is home, and thinking about like what home means for an OG Cree child or Creeness or prairie indigeneity, coming from the history of residential schools and the precarity of what it means to have a home or to like have access to home, through flashing forward to things such as the 60s Scoop and Child and Family Services kind of enacting a very similar type of assimilation project. So I really I wanted to kind of imbue, like I think home for me within the novel of Jonny Appleseed, so Peguis First Nation, Winnipeg, Manitoba, and even his little apartment that he lives in, they almost for me become like primary characters themselves, and the beaches too. And I think maybe that's something I learned from Toni Morrison, I would say, in Beloved, where she just kind of animates this like haunted house in such a way that it becomes as kind of dominant character. And I'm a huge Morrison fan, but that was one that's always stuck with me. So yeah, when I was writing about Jonny Appleseed, I wanted to be true to perhaps, I didn't want it to be quote unquote like trauma porn or poverty porn. And I didn't want it to rely too much on intergenerational trauma, although that's very much there, or residential schools. What I wanted to do was perhaps show what perhaps a non-Indigenous person might see the reservation as a wasteland, which in ways it can be. A lot of my family do live in somewhat decrepit homes, which are subjected to flooding every year from the rivers, primarily the Red. But I wanted to kind of be truthful to what Peguis First Nation and what Manitoba in general look like, in that they are harsh. We get plus 40 in the summer, we get minus 50 in the winter. It's a very harsh landscape to be there in the prairies. But to also empower that. So one, it's difficult. Two, there's really kind of genocidal histories. But three, there's also this untouchable and really kind of humble beauty that I wanted to also show. So for example, just there's like one little scene where there's this horse that's kind of surrounded by the floods, but he's still kind of thriving. And Jonny ruminates, oh, he's still so well fed in a place that's meant for death. And I think that was kind of the crux that I wanted to show with what I think of as home in the novel.
Mm-hmm. It's really moving, the way you're able to do all those things. And I might even have to listen back to this just to go through those references again. Your acknowledgement section is also an incredibly powerful piece of writing. And actually, when I got to that part, it felt like it kind of decoded some of the stuff that was going on, because the novel itself is such a kind of powerful punch in many ways. You say, Jonny has taught me a lot of things, but there are two that I want to share with you. One, a good story is always a healing ceremony. We recuperate, remember, and rejuvenate those we storytell into the world. I just love that word, storytell. And two, if we animate our pain, it becomes something we can make love to. Jonny really walks this fine edge between love and pain. And I guess I was wondering if it's difficult to be as unflinching as you seem to be about both of those things.
Very much. So Jonny is, like, first and foremost a novel, but it is very much, I think of like maybe as BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, or folks of color, or queer writers, or women, or disabled writers, or any intersection thereof. Those who are in the primary sources of power. When we storytell or we write, we're always undoubtedly like linked to the story itself. So like, yes, like this is a novel, and Jonny is a fictional character, but there are ways in which, almost like my own character Jonny, has kind of helped me heal and remember and rejuvenate as well. It's almost like bloodletting, I would say, or that I'm attached to the novel or the story with like an umbilical cord. So there are very much non-fictional elements of my life within Jonny. I'll leave those for you to perhaps ponder. But I think as a storyteller, it's ethical to be, it's our responsibility to be ethical to our characters as well, to listen to what they want to say, even if it's perhaps damning for one's own self or goes against their own code of ethics. So I think my job as a storyteller, or what we might say in Nehiawe and in Otachimo, is to listen fiercely to character, to myself, to the communities, and then also to not think of myself as writing singularly or as writing in a vacuum. So like the acknowledgements page is basically me having to kind of give back to every single person who has paved the way for this book to even be in the world. So perhaps I would say sometimes I think literature is also spelt as accountability, and it's always going to be, for me, embroiled within the community itself. I don't write singularly. It's always kind of a communal, reciprocal thing.
Oh, kia ora for that. That's just, fantastic thing to hear. Would you read to us now, please?
I would love to. It's been a while since I got to read my little glitter princess. So I put a call on Instagram, and this is what people wanted to hear, this chapter. So it's about midway through the novel. I told Tias about that night a few weeks afterwards. He came over while my mom was at bingo and my kukum, or grandmother, was in Winnipeg for the weekend. My body was shaking involuntarily as I recalled the story for him. I had to sit down, and he took me to my room, which was less an IKEA showroom and more a hand-me-down mattress without a box spring on the floor and a hamper for a dresser. My saving grace was my box TV and our pirated satellite, though. He brought me a cold cloth and he laid it on my forehead and told me everything was going to be okay. I asked him if he could hold me and say that. He did. After a few minutes, he took my hand in his and we laid our legs over top one another like a wishbone. We both stayed there looking at one another, not saying a word, sweat on our brows in the dry heat of August. I moved the cloth so it draped over both of us and we slid our heads that much closer. The tips of our noses touched and we left them there, puckering for a punic. We clasped one another like a zipper. The cloth blocked out all the light and we lay side by side in darkness. I felt the heat of his breath on my Cupid's bow. We slid off our jeans and raised our t-shirts to press our bodies closer, our nipples kissing too. Our breaths grew heavy. His thighs were bony and my clavicle dug into his, but it was the most comfortable I had been in a long time. After our bodies were drenched in sweat, we pulled off the cloth and we laughed. He stared at me for a long time. I saw new parts of his body I'd never seen before. A chickenpox scar on his cheek, the width of his bottom lip. We both knew what the other was feeling. Instead of saying we liked or we loved one another, we just lay there on our backs, our brown skin shiny in the rosy light that poured in from the evening sun. We surveyed each other's body, him seeing the scar above my clavicle from when I fell down the stairs as a kid, and me seeing the patch of hair missing from his scalp. I knew then that I loved him. It's funny though. Funny how an Indian love you sounds more like I'm in pain with you. Hi, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's so moving. Just to maybe finish, I'm really interested in, you've got some projects coming up as well. You've got Making Love with the Land, which explores the intersections of indigeneity, queerness, and most prominently mental health through a Nihio lens. And also Love After the End, Two-Spirit Utopias and Dystopias, a book of speculative fiction by Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer writers, which both sound amazing. Can you tell us more about those? What are you looking forward to about those projects?
Yeah, so I have Love After the End coming out again with Arsenal Pulp Press, same one as Jonny. That comes out in fall 2020. And we have 9 brilliant writers, mostly emerging, Indigenous writers, most of whom identify as queer or two-spirit or trans, coming forward telling all these stories, but instead focusing on the utopia, because I think we already kind of live as Indigenous and queer folks in a dystopian present, even more so now under COVID-19. So I'm very excited for that. I feel like I keep flip-flopping. So I do like this kind of nerdy cyborg book, and then it's like a novel about pain, and then a nerdy book. And then the forthcoming book that's written solely by me is, as you said, Making Love with the Land, and that comes out hopefully fall 2021 with Knopf Canada. And yeah, very much explores indigeneity, mental health, queerness, through perhaps, it's a very vulnerable lens, it's nonfiction. And I'm led there by Jonny, as the line, at one of the quotes you said, if you animate your pain, you can make love to it. He notes that a humility is just a humiliation you loved so much it transformed. So the book is really kind of thinking about like, how do we be accountable and reciprocal with things we might think of damning, such as insomnia or body dysmorphia. So stay tuned, I'm excited.
Joshua, thank you for sharing that with us. And if you can stay with us until we come back together at the end. But those are definitely books to look forward to, and we might be able to get you out here to talk about those books in future years. Okay, thank you. Remember, you can send through questions and I will see if we can fit them in. Our final guest this morning is RUBY MAE HINEPUNUI SOLLY. She is Kāi Tahu, Waitaha and Ngāti Mahoi. She's a musician, writer and taonga puoro practitioner living in Pōneke, Aotearoa. She's also a music therapist and has played with artists including Yo-Yo Ma, Trinity Roots and Whirimako Black. Ruby's poetry has been published in journals such as Landfall, Minarets and Starling. Her debut book, Tōku Pāpā, will be published by Victoria University Press in 2021. And her first album, the subject of our discussion today, discusses the hidden histories of Wellington as well as the part that the environment plays within the recording and composing process. Kia ora, Ruby.
Morena.
Morena. What's really exciting about being able to talk about your album Pōneke today is that in the original Auckland Writers Festival program, you were going to make music for our RENÉE evening event while other guests read their work. Now we get to hear some of those haunting, stunning sounds through the album, which is kind of a tour of the Wellington area. And in your introduction, you talk about all the voices that live and sing within us, and that you see time pulled around us like a korowai. We are layered within it. I was just wondering if you can tell us how those ideas are woven into the music as part of the process. And I'm thinking of things like layering sounds from different places.
Yeah, I can definitely talk to that. So I think that with the kind of visual sense or other senses, it can be quite easy to take away senses of history in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of erasure of especially Indigenous histories in those ways. And I think this is especially relevant at the moment when we're looking at kind of these statues being taken down around the world and Indigenous and Black uprising. And within the album, I was looking more at the concept of sound and how you can go to these places and these signs of these histories, the elements in the present and even possible futures are present there within sounds and within other things too. So within our pūrākau, for example, in our stories, we have elements that talk about different tohu and why they're there. So like at Red Rocks, it said that Kupe's descendants stood there and slashed their chests while he was leaving, and that's why the rocks are that colour, because that's their blood that's stained them, that they did to express their grief. So we have all these signs there that are our kind of version of statues and our kind of version of our origin stories. So it was kind of wanting to expose those and to kind of weave them all together using music as that common thread, music and poetry and art as well, to kind of give people a way into seeing that and understanding those layers beneath the places they live in, no matter kind of what sense kind of spoke to them.
Kia ora. Yeah, so it might not be 100% conscious, but the stories will filter through the music, and then there's the words and the images as well.
Yeah.
Sure. So you and I first met a few years ago when you came to my Māori and Pacifica creative writing class as a student, and then after a while I was getting to know you, and I found out that you were also completing a Masters of Music at the same time and studying poetry. And then since then you've published and performed all over Aotearoa, and as well as this album, we'll soon see the poetry collection. So that's really exciting to see you grow in that way. But is there a real strong intersect there for you between music and poetry?
There's a huge intersect, and I really appreciate when places can kind of understand that those things can be quite inseparable. I think especially in a lot of Indigenous kind of arts spaces. I can't speak to other ones, but I know within Te Ao Māori, like a lot of people I know who are kind of focused on expression, and it's all storytelling. Music is storytelling. I think anything that you've got an impact into the improvisation or the composition or even the representation of that, of how it's presented, it's all elements of storytelling, which is how we have passed those histories down. Storytelling is survival, and we just need to choose that form that it comes through. And for me, idea always comes first, and it's not necessarily a music idea or a writing idea or a film idea or anything like that. It's just an idea, and then you can kind of choose where you take it from there, I think.
I love that idea. Storytelling is survival, and all the different ways that it happens, and there's kind of a continuity there between what might be seen as pre-colonial or post-colonial or whatever you want to call it. It's all the same for Māori in terms of what way the story is told. And so Pōneke as an album, for me in my ears, it's quite mournful. There's some mournful sounds in it. And in an online conversation with Esa Mai Ranapiri, who was also part of our Nāianei series, the original series, you say, writing into a place is a very Māori way of creating, I think. And yes, it hurts to do it and to move through it. And there's a connection here, obviously, already happening between what Josh was talking about, what RENÉE was talking about, and this idea of the pain of connecting with some of these things. But I was wondering if you can talk about the necessity to move through these painful places as creators, and perhaps particularly as Indigenous creators, although I don't think it's limited to our indigeneity.
Yeah, I think it's lovely to bring Esa into the room too, because I know that Esa is a huge part of the kind of takatapui writing community in New Zealand. There's such an amazing support for all of us. And it was such a beautiful wānanga to have as well, because their work really does write into place, and often places they haven't had the opportunity to go to, and writes this narrative of kind of this disconnection that a whole bunch of Indigenous youth especially have, and kind of highlights that so people can really feel what it's like to be in the crux of that. And it's so important to be able to read those experiences by other writers so we can in turn be able to create these works. So yeah, for writing into those places, there's kind of a really beautiful way about writing, and it resonates a bit with what Joshua said about it feels like it, healing. It feels like a healing ceremony. It feels like, a whakaora in so many ways, because for me, this was writing myself into this place. It was me realizing I'm going to be here for a long time, and I'm not mana whenua here, but in a way, like I can mihi to things that are here. I can mihi to mana whenua, and how I communicate. Like I'm not going to stand up and do a whaikorero. I'm not a male whaikorero, kaikorero here. So I was like, this is how I speak. This is how I mihi. So that's what that work became. And for me, it was by learning about where I was and where I am, I was learning about who I was as well, and learning about the routes that my people have taken through this island to get to Te Waipounamu, which is our spiritual home, really, and kind of learning about what that looked like. Yeah.
Kia ora, Ruby. And so I wonder if we could hear some of those sounds now and your words.
Let's do it. So I've got, I'm going to read 4 quite short pieces that will have some of the tracks in the background, so you can get kind of an idea of how the pieces feed into each other. And then at the end, I'm going to read a piece from my book that's coming out in 2021, Tōku Pāpā. So first up, this is set in Karaka Bay. It was a karaka plantation from Kāti Māmoe, and those karaka trees are still there today. So this one is called Karaka Wana. Tōku tūpuna, you brought the seeds for this place all the way across the Pacific in your hand. You, the man of weaving worlds, Ruawharo te tohoka o Takitimu waka. Now here we are in a landscape that deafened settlers with the rolling of wails. Massive bodies pressing each other as if to create worlds. I stand feeling the ihi, the wehi, the wana of your children bubble under my feet, in a space that now is only this one world, with nothing under its waters but space. And this next one is in the same place, so it's its companion piece called Kāi Tahu, meaning kind of settled. And so this is kind of further back from the shore, inside that plantation. And there's a pi waka waka fantail that was there. We did some filming for this as a music video as well. And the same fantail probably showed up for both the recording of the music and for the recording of the video. So it's the same presence, which is a really beautiful tohu. E koro, thank you for telling me how karaka do not grow by the ocean by their own hands. Thank you for showing me the trees our Kāti Māmoe tupuna planted in this place. They still grow strong for us. I return here when you have gone. Deep in this plantation, I watch pi waka waka move between poison berries, unaware that time has moved, that the waves we can hear are cars by the shore. So the next two are companion pieces again called Machu and then Somes. So these are a tribute to Machu Somes Island, which was used as kind of a battle pa and is named after a descendant of Kupe, and was also used as a quarantine island and for prisoners of war as well in the Pākehā history. So this first one is a tribute to the island as Machu. E papa, kei hia koe. I slashed my breasts until the rocks were red for you. You name an island for me. Isn't this what all fathers do? Put their children out to sea, watch them grow roots into the expanse, and claim our new spaces for themselves. Then leave us to bleed our red soil into the waters they use to leave us behind. And this one is a tribute to kind of the Somes part of that place. And it's recorded in the battle, the gun emplacements on the island. So that has a kind of a natural reverb within it. I'm sorry, but this land is a waiting room. The stagnating wairua evaporating to slow mists, entrapped houses filled with chlorine, sulfur clouds in the air. This is a rugged purgatory for what you did, for what you didn't do. See the places where the guns sit, concrete, cold, empty, and waiting for a war that never arrives. Cool. And this last one is a piece that's coming out as part of my first proper collection of poetry, Tōku Pāpā, which I started writing in Tina's class actually, which is it's a really beautiful 360 moment. So this piece is called 6 for a Single, 8 Feet for a Double. And it's based on a Kāi Tahu mōtiatia. My father leaves school to dig graves. The first break is the hardest, the pressure of foot on steel, the smell of earth rising. Koia, koia, e taui, koia. The men sit with packed lunches, talking about the weather next to holes they have dug themselves. When he leaves the job, he keeps his shovel, always comes home to dig for the whānau. Koia, koia, e tau e koia. He keeps me playing graveside, tells me off for climbing the pile of earth, sends me to find things, the grave with the lamb, the grave with the clasped hands. He says, this is how the dead speak. A lamb for a child, clasped hands pulling each other up to heaven. But this is not the only way. The atmosphere traps us in our bodies, holds our teeth and tongues in place. My father says he has no rhythm, but when he digs, you see it in his body. the flow through the earth into the feet, contracting the calves, through the spine to chiseled arms, through aging hands into the shovel, and back into the whenua. Koia, koia, e taui, koia. With each beat, he piles up dirt higher and higher, making a lofty mountain for us to bow to.
Kia ora, Ruby. Yeah, Atahua. So beautiful. And yeah, I just want to listen to that for longer, but we'll continue. And before we move on to bringing us back together, I guess I just wanted to ask you, as the fresh new voice, and talking about 360s, we've got this kind of beautiful progression from great experience to brand newness in this conversation. And I was thinking about giving yourself permission to use your voice in the world in this way. There's such an onus on Indigenous writers to represent more than just their own story. So did you feel like you had to develop that ability to be a writer in the world and to speak your truth aloud?
It's an intense pressure, and it's one that I never realised that Pākehā writers don't always have to have that, or writers that are from kind of that group where you're not othered all the time. I never thought about it. But of course, every time you create something from an Indigenous space or from a queer space, there is going to be that thought from outside that this is what all of this is like, because it's the only information I know. And I think within that, there's a role where we all need to kind of whakamana other writers within those spaces so that people realise that that's not the only voice. And I think that's something that Takatapui culture does so well, is it manages to whakamana all these different voices. Like, I have a real great group of Takatapui writers that I hang out with, that I can check, that will check me if I'm doing something that isn't right, and who will like support me no matter what happens. And all our voices are incredibly different. We all love each other's work, but all of our voices are incredibly different. And I think that's part of what makes it amazing, and we need more and more of those voices to do that.
Totally, absolutely. And that was, I guess, a really huge part of the RENÉE series. So a brilliant place to finish there, Ruby. Thank you so much for that. And we'll just bring everybody back together now, because everybody has kind of hit on some really important stuff. And I don't know, Joshua, if you're familiar with the term Takatapui, but it would mean something like Indigiqueer. It's the queer community. It's an older Māori word for different sexualities, and kind of includes, I guess it's an inclusive term. So we have kind of some things that we've talked about. Storytelling as survival, the sense of writing home, all three of you, and the sense of responsibility as Indigenous, as in Takatapui, as Māori writers. To quote Joshua again, in terms of Jonny Appleseed, he tells his story unapologetically because he has no other choice, because there is no other story, because there is no other way to live. And I think that counts for everybody. One question that came through from an audience member is whether, and it was to Josh, but I think this applies to everybody, whether you have a sense of responsibility, this sense of responsibility, whether that means pulling back from writing about Indigenous people in negative ways. So there's this question of, are we, is this vital writing? Does responsibility weigh on us too heavily, or can we write us in our full positives and negatives, I guess? And do you feel an urgency about this? I wonder if each of you might be able to talk to that. It's not a very well-formed question, I'm sorry. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I've had criticisms about similar things, about writing negatively about, specifically in my book, I don't really center men, at least heterosexual cisgendered men. Primarily it's focused on two spirits, bisexual, Indigenous folks, and then primarily just Indigenous women. Part and parcel, because what I have been taught is that we always place our most vulnerable in the center, kind of as we would with like a wolf pack. And for too long, I've just, rightfully so, a lot of Indigenous men have been traumatized and abused in all forms. But for so long, I've seen them placed in the center. And while we have them in the center and we all collectively rally around them, we also have large scale things such as missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. So what I wanted to do was, write about the ways in which Indigenous masculinities harm Indigenous women and queer or two-spirit or trans Indigenous people, and to also hold them accountable too. A friend of mine, Kai Chang-Tom, Chinese Canadian writer here, trans writer as well, says that we should think of criticism as a gifting rather than as a culling. And I really think for me, it's, if I want to be accountable to communities, to myself, to my kin, I also have to be able to, perhaps as Indigenous writer Tracy Lindbergh says, tell the ugly stories too, or to not shy away from the negative, as perhaps another Cree writer, Billy Ray Belcourt, might say, to revel in the negative affects as well. In order to kind of, so if I had to combine those three writers, Tracy Lindbergh, Billy Ray Belcourt, and Kai Chang-Tom, is to not shy away from the bad, but also to not glamorize it for the sake of selling, to like trauma or poverty porn, but to use criticism, as I might say, perhaps, or the negative, as a means of creating a stronger community and healing together.
Kia ora, Josh. And I've also got a message that you've made new fans here, so I'll pass that on afterwards. RENÉE, you also don't shy away in this a really important story of home and what is taken from people and when they're put in homes that aren't their own. Did you feel a sense of responsibility, or do you ever want to get away from that?
I do feel a sense of responsibility to tell their stories, because, well, very few of the stories have been told, except, say, some of them have been managed to say to an inquiry, to, these four strangers sitting up the front, but most they tell you over a cup of tea, or we meet somewhere. And yes, I feel I have a responsibility, but I also feel I have a responsibility to show success as well. That I like the idea of Ruby being haunted by her past and looking for her parents and those sorts of things, but also being smart and in your face and vigorous and liking pies and all that sort of thing. I like to include takatapui all the time. All my novels have had that in, because it's such a lovely term. I love it because it's so inclusive. It doesn't divide us into segments or anything like that. We are all under this one beautiful umbrella, and takatapui, it's just such a beautiful, beautiful thing. I love it. I love the expression. I use it as often as I can because it is so inclusive. So I write about that, and I write about the world of a village or world of a town, and that includes takatapui. Surprise, surprise. I mean, we're all around. We walk up the street. We're old, we're young, and we're finding out, and we know, and some of us know, and all that. It's a great adventure for me to write about that, and it hasn't always been received all that well. I remember a reviewer saying, well, I don't know what sort of women RENÉE mixes with, but I can tell her we don't have those sort of women here. And I thought, well, I've got news for you, darling. They're all around. It's just that they're never seen. And if it's true that we read to find ourselves, then a lot of us have never been able to find ourselves in a lot of books, but I hope at least Takatapui anyway will find themselves in mine.
Brilliant. I don't know why, it just makes me so happy listening to what you have to say, Renee. I think I do know why. Ruby, I've already asked you about responsibility. So I guess to finish off, I guess, yes, we've got this weight, but how do you know, what keeps you going? How do you take care of yourself in this process? What are the joys?
Oh my gosh, I'm the worst person to ask that question. I think I heard Rangi Kohu Morgan briefly talk about this last year at Hui, and I said to her, I said, what do you do when you get tired? And she said, we can't afford to be tired.
No.
We can't afford to be tired. She's like, we have the most, Māori women are the most represented in prison in the entire world. Like, you know, our children are being taken, you know, we have people being ripped from their whenua, like all of these things are happening. We can't afford to be tired. And that was not the response I was expecting. I was expecting her to be like, you know, you should, you know, play kawa with yourself and do all these things. But she was like, no, you can't afford to be tired. And I think there's a lot within there. I think there's something else I do now is I think about why people are wanting something, or why people are wanting to consume something. And I look at those reasons very carefully now, and I didn't used to. And I definitely look at when someone asks for work, or when somebody asks you questions about your art form, what you're making. I kind of look very carefully and see if they're there for the right reasons. And I think when you create work as well, there's this really interesting thing where you're almost creating a code for certain people who'll read your work. So when I'm writing something that's definitely consumable on the surface for everybody. Consumable is a gross word there, but that's what the majority of people will be doing. But then there's this behind it, there's that hohonu, that layer underneath, those deeper layers that have pieces for takatapui, and they have these stories. So giving your writing and your music like a whakapapa that goes deeper than that surface, that gives them histories and acknowledges all the things that have made that writing come into being by being woven underneath. So I think that's part of how I do it, is I have that happening underneath to hold it up and know that you're kind of creating resources in a way for those people to read. I just spent a year only reading books by Māori authors, which was incredible. And I read books by both you, Tina, and both you, Renée, during that year. And then the first book I read when I came out was a book by Joshua. So like a slow transition out, right? I mean, but yeah, and I completely agree with what Renée said. You know, we don't see ourselves in books, and I'm usually a very fast reader. I can read things really quickly because I'm reading that surface, because there isn't that whakapapa to those words for me, because that's not mine. But it took me forever to read these books because I would be so emotional or be really thinking about something, and it felt like learning to read all over again. And it made me realize a lot about my purpose as a writer and what that looks like to be writing those manuals and those codes. And those, you know, it's you're writing manuals for being. And like, you know, if you're takatapui or Indigenous, that people can choose to take part in or not, and that's totally fine. You're just giving them a book and saying, if you want to learn from what I've learned and what my ancestors have learned, here you go.
I could talk with you three forever, and I hope we get that opportunity again one day. I think writing manuals for being is a nice place to finish. So thank you all for your wisdom, and it's just been a real joy. And so ka nui tēnā, ngā mihi mai oha kia koutou katoa. Massive thanks to our writers, our audience, and the Auckland Writers Festival team and Auckland Live. The festival has a generous group of sponsors and partners, and would like to acknowledge their crucial support. These are listed on the festival's website. This episode can be viewed again at your leisure there as well. Thank you for being here with us today, Renée, Joshua, and Ruby. So you can tune in again next week when Paula Morris will be talking with Canadian writer, artist, and publisher Leanne Shapton about guest book Ghost Stories. Kolokisa Umahina Tuai, co-editor of Crafting Aotearoa, A Cultural History of Making in New Zealand and the Wider Moana Oceania, and Neil Gaiman with the special new illustrated edition of his best-selling novel, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Nō reira, e ngā hau e whā, ka nui te mihi, kia koutou katoa.